Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Uncensored CMO. Now, it's become a bit of a tradition that once a year I ask the absolutely fabulous Sarah Carter and Les Binet, authors of How Not to Plan, to come on the show and tell us what we should be paying more attention to, what's the surprising data that they can bring, and what do they know about marketing effectiveness that every marketer should be paying attention to. I love these two. They're always great value, great sense of humour, and they're all over the data. So this will not disappoint. So pay attention, buckle up, and let's get into it. So welcome back to Uncensored CMO, Les and Sarah.
Hello.
Sarah and Les.
And you got the names right.
You notice I didn't stumble and say Peter this time.
I noticed that.
I've learned something since last time. I've forgotten. This is going out in January. We're recording this in December. So, but looking back to last year, pretty good year for the agency as well. I think I'm right in saying at the IPA you won with McCain a Grand Prix and as an agency of the year in terms of effectiveness agency. So congratulations.
Thank you. And the Charles Channon Award, which is the kind of best new learning, which is the one that we're probably most proud of, because that's a sort of gift to the industry award, really, if you like, the sort of new learning that hopefully everybody can take away and run with usefully. So, yeah, we're very happy with that.
The McCain paper is the only paper in history to win both the Grand Prix and the Charles Channon, which makes it, I think, in points terms, the most highly awarded IPA award in the history of the competition.
Well, there you go. That's pretty amazing. So if you could sort of, for anyone listening and watching that hasn't read the paper, what was it about the McCain work that, struck a chord?
Well, I think there's a couple of big lessons in there. One is about the value of long-term consistency, which is something that System 1 has also been talking about recently. So, that was a consistent campaign over 10 years. And the other thing, which I think is linked to it, is the effect on price sensitivity and pricing power and, ultimately margins and profit. And it's quite interesting that those two things go together, that long-term consistency means long-term improvements in pricing power, which is something we've seen before.
Yeah, and the other interesting consistency bit, which I hadn't realised till I heard the marketing director talk, was that he had been there the whole time of that campaign. So that's a kind of 10-year consistency marketing story as well, which, again, we've been hearing this year with, I think you talked to Yorkshire Tea, didn't you? Again, another company with incredible longevity with their marketing personnel. Laithwaite's actually won an effectiveness award. Same, and there's another interesting theme about family-run companies here as well. Yes. Question, is there a reason why they are more dedicated to the long term and have people who stay longer? But it's interesting, all those companies are... Specsavers is another one, did very well at the effect of another family-owned company. So, yeah, interesting theme there.
It's very stark, isn't it? My experience of family-owned companies is they think in generations.
Yes.
They're not thinking in terms of quarterly results.
Yeah,
and I think that's and very much want to build a culture that everyone feels like they want to stay at and be part of the success.
Yeah. That was very much one of the kind of central planks of that McCain paper, wasn't there? Which I'm going to forget the name. The what was it called?
Lodish and Mellor.
They sound like some dodgy Eurovision sort of duo, don't they? Lodish and Mellor, which was a paper about, brands are built on the long term. Why do we kind of plan them in quarters? And that was the kind of theme of the paper, really. And that's a good overall theme.
It's a famous, moderately famous for nerds like
famous
me.
For you, yeah.
Academic paper from the early 90s called "If Brands Are Built Over Years, Why Are They Managed in Quarters?" And it talks about the importance of long-term metrics to help steer brands and avoid them being short-term in their marketing.
That sounds like something every marketer should read then, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because I think with the whole CMO tenure as well and the churn, marketing has the biggest churn of any department. CMO is the shortest lived role on the C-suite and all this kind of thing that we know. Yeah. And yet marketing really has the biggest impact on long-term health of the business.
And I think that's been one of the big themes of the year generally. We'll probably talk about all these themes, long-term campaigns, kind of consistent agency client partnerships, clients in jobs a long time, brands being built over 10 years. McCain's didn't really start kicking up on the payback till after 3 years, I think, wasn't it? This whole idea of sort of owning things that you need is not something that you don't have something that you own. Owning is a verb, I think. You roll your sleeves up and own things, and that takes 10 years probably as well. So there's an overall theme on longevity with all these things.
And the other sometimes lost point about that is that also there's a long history and heritage with a lot of brands that we don't often honour and respect. So often tapping into what's gone before and all the latent awareness and associations with brand is something that lots of marketers tend to junk very quickly in pursuit of creating a new thing, back to the kind of creative consistency point of view.
Yeah.
So what we're going to attempt to do today is come up with 10 things that people should think about as they head into 2025, because this will be going out hopefully in the first week in January. I thought I'd start, as I do most presentations, Sarah, by the way. So I think you are officially my most quoted person, which is you are not the customer.
The yellow Post-it.
The yellow Post-it.
Rears its head
the
again.
famous yellow Post-it note. So the thing that, two things for me last year jumped out on this point. The first one was when Campaign made Coke's AI version of Holidays Are Coming their Turkey of the Week. Contrast that with the System 1 response, and it was actually an incredible success. The interesting insight for me was people did not care that it was made by AI. The only people that cared were marketers, and we got our absolute knickers in a twist over it. Meanwhile, if you're looking at what consumers think, they didn't care. What they saw was basically the product of a 25-year campaign that evokes a memory, evokes emotion, lots of memories and associations with the Coke brand, and that they did a successful job. I mean, I must confess, actually, when I first saw the ad, I was like, what have they done? Like, why would you mess? Like, literally, you've got this 25-year classic. It's like a Christmas classic, isn't it? That you watch Only Fools and Horses, and then you think, you wouldn't re-edit Only Fools and Horses, would you?
That is the bigger issue, I think. Why, the whole point, I'm not sure you'll probably start with that ad today, but its value is its repetition, isn't it? And the fact it doesn't change. It's like getting the kind of dodgy Christmas baubles down from the attic that you've had on your tree for 20. You probably wouldn't buy them now, but the fact they have stayed the same is a massive part of the appeal. So why would you change it? Anyway,
I'm curious, do ordinary members of the public know it's AI?
Do you know what? Interestingly, when we did the analysis, there was zero mention of it being AI.
Yeah.
So people responded to what they saw, and they saw Coke trucks. They heard this. They heard the music, the aesthetic. I mean, this is a problem, right? Once you're in marketing, you no longer look at the world as a normal person, and it's a real problem. This is why I keep coming back to your advice. Yeah. And so what I noticed is they're responding to the things they know and love about Coke at Christmas, right? They're not going, it looks artificially generated, but you wouldn't look at a Disney movie and go, oh, why is that not real people?
They used to ads having things in that aren't real.
Yes,
that's kind of that's no
Polar
big deal
bear's
at
okay.
all.
I mean, if you look at the original ad, it's got, a bit of animation on the back of the truck, hasn't it? I mean, that's not real, is it?
It is an ad. You're in a kind of different mindset for watching something.
No, people don't have a problem with CGI or cartoons or whatever.
Exactly. And that's the thing. I think we forget that, don't we? I mean, Disney actually is a good example because they consistently do very, very, very effective work, and it's all animated. That's their whole. That's the whole expertise.
I don't think anyone looks at our Disney Christmas ad and says, "Oh, that's terrible," because he's got an octopus on his head, and you wouldn't normally have. You don't assess things like that.
Do you know what I love about that is if you had pitched that as an idea, I'd be like, really?
Yeah.
But Disney get away with it. This is partly the magic of Disney and the animation and what they do, isn't it? That they can do things that conceptually you just go, that's a bit odd, but somehow work. I'd love to know from you guys, what's a great example of this insight that you are not the customer?
Well, the one we talk about a lot is car advertising. So planner that we used to work with, who was a planner on Volkswagen, used to have a Post-it note stuck to his computer monitor, saying, remember, new car buyers are old. Because I think the average new car buyer the average age of a new car buyer is about 60. Because young people don't buy new cars. They tend to buy second-hand cars because they can't afford them,
They don't drive very much now.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're selling cars, new cars, you need to be thinking in a 60-year-old's mindset. But of course, people in advertising agencies, what's the average age? 20-something, are thinking about themselves. So they want to create advertising that
Well, I think wasn't there some data from WPP showing the percentage of their employees over it was either 40 or 50 was 3 or 4%. It was very, very small. So you're right. If you're working on a car brand, you're probably 20 years
at least
away from the demographic you're thinking about.
More like 30.
Or 30 years,
Or half a lifetime.
Yeah, there you go. Right,
Yeah,
that's
no,
quite
I mean, my example would, well, I mean, we'll probably come on to talk about purpose as well, but that whole collective losing of our marbles over purpose period, I think, I mean, I thought it would be quite good to have a COVID inquiry, a purpose inquiry. So why exactly did we do that? Because we should learn from it. But to me, it is just a function of lack of market orientation, isn't it? We've just got to get comfortable with our insignificance in people's lives, and that, you know, we influence the least important decisions by and large that people make. And the best thing we can often hope for is that they just chuck our brand in their basket without thinking about anything, and that's fine, that's good. But instead we want other people to think what we think about life, and we want them to feel what we think might be important is important. And I mean, it's terrifying really when you think of what, you know, that whole purpose period sort of did in terms of waste of money and waste of profit, the implications of that sort of thing. I've got a market orientation question for you. Les and I do little quizzes for the planners quite often, and we're just looking at stats at the moment. So what percentage of the UK, this isn't trick question, what percentage of the UK population use Twitter or X, do you think? At the moment?
If I had to guess, I'd probably go somewhere between 8 and 10%. Probably not over 10%, I don't think, because I think it's disproportionately used in the news. And yeah, I'd go 10%.
I don't know the answer to this, so can I guess?
Oh, go on, Les.
Go on, you guess, yeah.
Well, first of all, it would depend on exactly how you define usage, like ever used
in the
or
last
have
year,
a
I
whatever.
think it's PGI, so.
Well, if it's used in the last year, I think I would guess somewhere between 10 and 15%. So I'm going to say 13%.
Okay. And what percentage of the UK population buy bird seed in a year, do you think?
Oh, hang on. Now you've got me. This is out of my realm of knowledge. This feels like a trick question. My gut says like 5%,
right,
but you might tell me that everyone that goes to school has a birdseed class, and then it's 20%.
This is adults playing. Well, I mean, you don't need to answer it, but actually the answer to both
is the same.
Is exactly the same, and it's 22%.
22?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I think most people in our industry would, and you were good on this, but would massively overestimate the Twitter X usage and massively underestimate the birdseed figure. And we just think that birdseed figure is so interesting because there's just so much flows from that, really. If you're buying birdseed, you're sitting at home with quite a lot of time on your hands. You're there in the daylight because you're looking out the window, you know, and we probably don't know anyone who buys birdseed, any of us. But it's just a funny little fact, but I think it's just quite illuminating.
And a nice link's the logo of Twitter as well. Oh,
yes, exactly. Exactly.
Different kinds of
the analogy
tweets.
just ran out.
I was going to say to you what percentage use X, but that just sounds like a weird, a different sort of question.
It's a different platform, that one. Yeah, exactly. We won't talk about
anyway,
that.
so yeah, but just as an example, I think it's quite good to, a market orientation test, a sort of MOT every year wouldn't be a bad thing, would it?
I think there's a couple of things going back to the purpose and losing the plot. I think one is just straightforward ignorance, in that many people who work in advertising simply don't know what the world is like outside their bubble, age-wise, London-centric wise, being graduates and blah 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 blah. So there's ignorance of what the world is outside, and little statistics like that one can make people's eyes pop, can't they? Because you tell people what basic stuff about people's working habits and media habits and the demographics of the population, and they go, the world can't be like that because that's not how I live. And then there's another thing which is more reprehensible, really, which is a kind of elitism, which is, even if people do live like that, we don't want to talk to those people because, we want to advertise to Gen Z, because why would you want to talk to 60 pluses or 55 pluses? Because it's a bit grubby, really.
You mean the percentage of the population that own about 60% of the nation's wealth, that spend a lot of money?
Yes, exactly.
That part of the
We'd
population.
rather talk to the funky people with no money.
Yeah.
The other day when we were talking about this podcast, Kerry made a comment about Greggs, and she was kind of apologetic about raising Greggs, almost like, this is not the kind of brand we want to be talking about, And I thought, it's the world, the real world includes an incredible range of diversity of opinions and lifestyles. We talk about diversity a lot, but actually we're not
that diverse.
We're only
when it comes
certain
to
type of diversity.
We're only interested in certain types of diversity.
Yeah.
You know, nothing grubby.
I mean, the Specsavers IPA paper, I don't know if people have read it or not, but I would advise that. But there was just that's a brilliant example of talking to particular. So there, you know, I didn't go to Specsavers because they come to me to advertising their home visit service for eye tests and actually ear tests as well. That was just a fascinating paper because in focusing on that, they actually grew the brand as a whole because it said something about the brand and its customer orientation. And, you know, if they do that, then they do other stuff as well. So I thought that was a really interesting example of how you can use that sort of customer orientation to people who are not normally targeted and actually to the benefit of the whole brand. So they're a good brand to learn from, I think, in so many ways.
Not everyone can get out. There's a lot. I mean, disability, going back to representation, actually, disability is another very big overlooked group.
Absolutely.
And
that's one that I get.
Population struggle with a disability of some kind.
I have got quite cross about that at times because it's hard to get a precise measure of it. There is a measure of disability which suggests that about 15% of the population is disabled in some way. And in fact, we as an agency have been involved with a campaign called We Are the 15. And yet it's not a kind of diversity measure that is insufficiently fabulous, if you like.
Yes. Well, genuinely, I don't think I've ever been as humbled in my life, actually, as we produce this series called Feeling Seen at System 1, where we look at the impact of representing different groups of people. And we did a version of that on disability. And I remember turning up to host the panel about it. And you know when you're not mentally prepared for what's about to happen. You don't sort of think about it. Yeah. So I was recovering from a bike accident where I smashed 6 ribs and a collarbone. I was on morphine for 8 weeks. And it was pretty brutal, right? But I was just back on my feet. And my first day out in London was to host this thing on disability. And I walked in, I wasn't prepared to see a panel of very disabled people in wheelchairs. I knew I was going to talk about disability. The reality of it hit me. And I remember the guy at ITV who had sort of set the thing up, he came up to gave me a big hug and, it's good to see you back on your feet. Good to see you recovered. I was so sorry to see what happened to you. And I was just hit with this sudden, do you know what? I've recovered. I'm stood here. I'm stood in front of 5 very disabled people that would have climbed mountains just to be in this room. And you're talking to me and, you know, celebrating me. And I'm like, dude, come on, please. I just said, look, don't, you know, I've recovered. But I'm now going to have a conversation with 5 people for whom just planning a day in London is like, you know, climbing Everest sort of thing. And it just really struck me that in terms of, I mean, part of the problem is we sort of rank diversity, don't we? We shouldn't do, you know, but if ever you were to pick an audience for whom it's a real challenge just to live life, then, but also inspiring as well. I mean, just also talking about their attitudes and, you know, what they've overcome and so on is just trying, you know, just fantastic. So, and
a real opportunity to say something about the brand. I mean, the new AirPods hearing product, you know, I don't know if you've seen that. They've actually, it's a Christmas ad about that, a guy who has impaired hearing and can't hear his daughter playing her guitar properly. And it's a product demo, basically, which could go at any time of year, but have chosen to talk about it at Christmas time. So you get the kind of emotional heft addition to that. But again, it says something about the brand as a whole, doesn't it? That it's rolling its sleeves up and doing something practical to help people rather than just putting people in wheelchairs in. Is not what it's about.
That's very tokenistic. I think the highest scoring Super Bowl campaign of all time, and the ad that has brought me closest or 2 tears in my entire life is Microsoft. I don't know if you remember this from about 5 years ago. Microsoft did an ad about their new game controller, and you've got a very, very disabled son, and the mum and dad are sat on the sofa talking about the fact that when the son's playing with the new game controller, he's no longer disabled, and he can be in the world on a par with everybody else. And you see this quite a tough guy, you know, sort of tattooed, sort of, you know, skinhead type guy, and he's just, you can see him breaking up as he talks about his son so proudly that. And just the statement he says, he's not disabled when he's playing. And I thought, you know, particularly as a parent, parents, you know, once you become a parent, you sort of like, all these things really hit you extra double, don't they? But
right,
I thought, wow, you know, that's powerful stuff. All right, so on that bombshell, we'll move on to.
You've been listening to The Rest is History.
Indeed, yes, on that bombshell. Second thing I thought we should talk about is the unsung hero of the 4 Ps, which is pricing, and how as marketers, back to we don't like to talk about it as much as we should do, but it's incredibly important, isn't it? We forget price at our peril.
I mean, first of all, the 4 Ps. We sort of forget that marketing is about the 4 Ps, not just the 1 P. We talked about that, didn't we? 1 P marketing.
Yep.
Pricing should be part of the marketer's job to think about pricing. And I think we have long known, but we have often forgotten that advertising and marketing communications can affect pricing power. So I think there's almost a feeling that this is a new discovery. It's not a new discovery. We've known about this for a long time, but it is more in people's minds, I think, over the last couple of years. And the McCain paper that we talked about earlier, I think one of the reasons that won the Charles Chatham was it was a good demonstration of the effect of long-term emotional consistency on pricing power.
And I think that's what the chairman of the judges said. This is the one paper that we've been waiting for, that all marketing people will want to take to their CFOs and the board, because, who wouldn't want to see this effect of advertising? So it's really put the spotlight, as you say, on something that was just a little couple of bars in your sort of longer and broader thing, wasn't it, of all the effects of brand building campaigns. But you literally put the spotlight on that and blew the whole paper up around it.
That's the thing I read. That's what I saw, is that chart, that price sensitivity going down
what a killer chart.
As the campaign went up.
We have proved this before. It's just people have forgotten. So Felix IPA papers looked at it. The Lurpak IPA paper looked at it. But it's good to remind people.
There's something about it being about chips and potato, though, I think, that makes it even more powerful, don't you? I mean, you couldn't get a more kind of neutral canvas to paint that picture on than a bit of potato. I mean, you can't get much more generic than that.
A commodity.
Humble, simple commodity. But if you can do that with communication to build a brand and a price premium around a bit of potato, then kind of it's just the most brilliant example, isn't it, of the power of
And presumably the other
like
Ps that are fairly consistent as well. So you've got a brand that's been around a long time. Distribution presumably is fairly consistent. I mean, McCain's in every
100%,
supermarket, right? So they haven't changed that.
Actually,
innovation, probably,
a bit
I don't know how
around the
much
edges,
innovation there's going to be on chips,
peripheral.
but it's going to be peripheral. So the thing that changed was the creative input, and the thing that then came as a result was
there's a
pricing.
kind of purity about it, which has just made a brilliant case. And I just love the fact that, I mean, I don't think if we were here this time last year, we wouldn't have been talking about McCain's at all then, would we? It's just a sort of hidden in plain sight. And I love the fact that while LinkedIn is going mad around Jaguar or Liquid Death or whatever, there are campaigns like McCain or Specsavers or Yorkshire Tea or whatever that are just quietly knocking it out of the park. With
chugging along.
Yes,
just sort
not
of,
talked about. But they are this year, and suddenly they're kind of they're fighting back.
I love that that's the case, actually, because I think that marketing's challenge is it hasn't got a strong reputation in the boardroom. In fact, I had Chris Burgrave, he was the CMO at Heineken for 10 years. He's now a non-exec. He's written a paper on basically marketing's reputation in the boardroom. And if you ask CEOs and board, which skill set do you admire most, and you would rank it, number one, financial acumen, last is marketing, right? And consumer representation, which is insane, because back to you are not the customer, it could be consumer first. It's crazy that in the most powerful room in most kind of companies, they're not valuing marketing most. And this is why I think the pricing thing is so important, because you're suddenly talking the language of the boardroom. And the other thing with pricing power as well is it drops the bottom line. So your impact on profit, if you can sustain a premium, is enormous. And guess what, everybody? You can then afford to spend money on what? Building your brand, and executing it in store. So, it's beautiful.
I mean, Peter and I said this in 2007. I think if you look in marketing in the era of accountability, one of the things we said there was that increasing volume is good. Increasing pricing power is generally more profitable. But actually, it's both and. The sweet spot is to do both. And if you can do both, the payback is enormous. It's like a quantum leap above. And you can do both. It's like, and again, I keep coming back to Felix cat food, which is, I know it makes me sound very old, but we wrote papers on that years ago. And we took that brand from being a cheap brand on the edge of being delisted to being market leader at premium prices. And the key driver of that was long-term, consistent cartoon cats.
Yeah.
Bit like the Yorkshire tea story as well, isn't it? As you say, gone from
The Yorkshire tea
number
story is
3
incredible.
to brand leader in the most commoditized sort of unchanging market. I mean, I used to work on PG tips, and the graphs just were flat for decades. Nothing ever changed in that market. So to do that in tea is phenomenal.
It really is. I think people forget. You're absolutely right. It's a category in very gradual decline, 2 or 3% a year, gradual decline.
Yeah.
It's not a category that retailers care that much about. So so again, it's also low margin.
Yeah.
So there isn't much profitability in it. So to go from, I think it was something like 15 or 16% to 40%.
I mean, it's phenomenal.
I mean, that is a change you don't see very often, particularly in legacy categories, which are commoditized. And a bit similar to, there were, obviously there's innovation and availability, but the ability to tie back to the long-term brand building impact. And they're still running some of the campaigns they came up with eight or 9 years ago.
Yeah.
It hasn't changed. The consistency is there.
Yeah.
Which brings me on actually to point 3, beautifully, as if by magic.
See what we did
We're
there.
going to be circling a few themes here, but the third point I wanted to talk to you about was consistency, but not to get confused with a lack of creativity. And I think this is a really important point, isn't it? That I think we sort of think there's this either or. Either I'm being creative and doing something new, or I'm being consistent and boring. But actually, that's not the case with consistency, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, if you take our Marmite love-hate campaign, which has been going for, I don't know, 30 years, 40, I don't know how, anyway, many decades. I mean, all creators would kill and do kill to work on that. We win at Cannes with that, we win effectiveness awards. So it's certainly not the case that creativity dies with that, nor is it the case you need to keep showing exactly the same ad every year either. To me, it is almost the most powerful role for creativity to make the familiar fresh, as we call it, or I've heard this phrase the other day, the familiar stranger is what we're trying to...
Yeah.
I think in the music industry, they talk about disguised repetition, that the secret of a good music track is just repeating enough to please our brains because we like that, but then a little bit of a difference because our brains also like a bit of novelty. And, what greater role for creativity is there than to do that, to take core elements and twist them each time. And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity for creativity.
We're actually skipping from advertising to innovation, but to make the parallel point, at System 1 we were looking at something, I think it was like 40 or 50,000 innovations, and looking at the emotion that people felt when they saw the innovation, and then we looked at the in-market results to see which ones had succeeded or not. And there's almost this magical mix of John Kieran, who came up with it, describes it as 80% familiar, 20% new.
Yeah.
But what he meant by that was you look
thing.
at the emotional response, and 20% of the emotion was surprise. But 80% was kind of familiarity, happiness, all the sort of, yes, I'm reassured by
Absolutely,
this. But what was interesting is when you saw brands going over the 20%, so 30 or 40% surprise, those are the ones that were just too much for people to get their heads around.
Yeah.
The ones that were 90% familiar, well, there's nothing to see here.
I think that's a good
and
point.
that was a weird sort of average that came through.
We're not getting into Jaguar now, are we? But discuss.
We might have to have
I know we're not
Jaguar
going to do
talk on
that.
here,
But they're certainly not going with a kind of
They've gone,
80-20
flipped
rule
that
on
on
that. No,
side,
exactly. So, but yeah, it's a great skill to get that balance right. But there's magic in that, and that's what we need to do.
Byron talks about Byron Sharp, that is, talks about consistency and freshness. That the challenge is to do something that builds on what you've done before, at the same time keeping it fresh enough that people are interested.
Yeah.
And I think you talked about innovation. People who design packaging, I think, kind of know this. That if you look at the evolution of the cornflakes packet over however many. How long has it been going? 100 years or whatever it is. That you sort of see there's little tweaks all the time, but there's a continuity. If you go too far, you mess things up.
This is a really good point, actually. I think the majority of rebrands actually see sales decline in the short term before they go up, because what they've done is they've interrupted the autopilot that people have. I know what it is, I know where it is, and I'll just buy it. And suddenly it's like, that feels like it's not the same.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. The ability to iterate design without changing what people perceive of you is
and this
super
is
critical.
an interesting thing, is that you use the word interruption, and disruption is another word that's been seen as the kind of the good word, and consistency is the kind of like, who wants to be consistent? That's really boring. But actually, I was thinking with train stations, like disruption is not a good word at all, is it? And it's sort of like, why in our industry has that been seen as a good word? So we kind of need to flip the status around from rewarding those who do consistency well, I think, to those who just kind of rip stuff up. I was going to make one more point on that. I think people think consistency means a kind of passive not doing something, whereas there's a very, and should be very well rewarded, active skill in handling consistency. I mean, we've done a lot of work with Marmite over the years to stop that love-hate thing being changed, and it takes hard work to keep people to that. We've had, a famous Italian client who came along and said he can understand how English people could talk about hating a food, because that's not something that happens. Like he liked the love bit, but could we not just drop the hate bit? And we have a lot of those, and we do lots of workshops to try and talk about the power and to stop that being changed. And maybe we need to reward marketers for the decisions they don't make to change as much as as another role. I thought the chief continuity officer,
I was going to say,
maybe we need to just raise the status of all this.
I think that the word continuity rather than consistency might be more helpful.
I think that's good.
You talk about compounding as well, don't
that's
you?
That's a good word too.
The idea of building on what you've done before rather than throwing it out. So continuity or compounding has a sense of evolution and growth, rather than just, let's just stick with what works sort of thing. I think there's a subtle shift. At that point, you mentioned about rebranding and stuff like that. So Peter and I looked at this in, I think, effectiveness and in context. And one of the things we found was that, by and large, when campaigns are about relaunching or rebranding, that typically leads to a reduction in the effectiveness.
Wow. So it follows through.
I think it's one of the biggest reductions of effectiveness there is. So if you decide to go down that route of rebranding or whatever, it has to be a really big, important investment. It's not something you should do lightly. You have to understand that you're probably, in the short term, going to lose some money. And sometimes that may be the right thing to do. If your brand or your product or your company has got completely out of touch with, where the profit is, then maybe there's a time to change. But we, in our industry, I think, have a little bit of a tendency to reach for relaunching or rebranding or disruption as, that would be a good thing, let's kick it all in.
I love the idea of pricing in the cost of a relaunch, because no one ever thinks about what's the downside of doing this, or can I account for that in my planning? And when Andrew wrote the compound creativity work, one of the, I think the not surprising insights actually, but the ones that got picked up a lot was the cost of changing creative agency or creative idea. And it's almost like you reset yourself every time, whereas the ones that were consistent had this compounding effect, and the gap got bigger the more years you evidence the continuity.
And I think that's where there's a difference again between packaging and advertising. I think maybe there's the example of Tropicana, isn't it, that everybody knows, that was a disaster when they disrupted too much, but that doesn't seem to be the equivalent sort of examples of that in the comms world, and maybe there should be. But we're not saying that nothing should ever change, but as you say, you just need to go into it with your eyes open and do it with more kind of intent and consideration, really.
So, we were talking earlier about, nuance and the fact that the marketing industry and perhaps human beings in general are just not very good at nuance. And, it's... There are times when you do need probably to start again. Another old example that we're familiar with is Alan Wicker versus Rowan Atkinson on Barclaycard. So when Rowan was first introduced, initially...
Everything fell off a cliff.
Everything fell off a cliff.
Because if you'd done 10 years of something and then you changed your kind of lead representative of your brand, it looked terrible, but it all came back in a year. But you needed to be prepared for that.
So that idea of factoring in the price of a change. And thinking about that as an investment. I was actually in a meeting the other day with a client where they're talking about some issues to do with their brands and their brand architecture, and should they change it? And, yes, well, there's going to be a cost to that, but it could be in the very long run that's the right thing to do.
We had the same actually on System 1 because we were called Brain Juicer, and then
You
5
were.
years
Yeah,
ago
you're right, yeah.
we did this big rebrand.
Yeah.
Same thing happens.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
initially everyone's like, who are
Yeah,
they?
yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And we
Yeah,
actually had to start from scratch. Now
Yeah.
we've overtaken where we were, and we're now clear about what we are. You know, I guess we were about innovation and unique research techniques, that sort of thing. And now we're more clearly a testing platform for creative ideas
Yeah.
and innovation.
No.
But we've had
Example.
that shift has been painful. I
Yeah.
mean, there has been a definite short-term cost. Fortunately, it's all come good in the end,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and we made it. But it wasn't without its bumps.
Yeah.
And interestingly, when I hadn't really thought about this, but when campaigns change, it is usually when the agency changes as well, isn't it? And also when the marketing people, so everything changes at once. And maybe you argue you'd be better to just change one of those and keep two others the same or whatever. So
The obvious historical point, but the reason we obsess with innovation and disruption is because of tech envy, because it's, looking at, is Clay Shirky the innovator's dilemma?
Clayton Christensen, Innovator's Dilemma. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Sound like a mashup of Fergal Sharkey and Clayton Christensen. I know it's Christmas.
But the point is, that this theory that, disruption is, an incredibly powerful force in technological innovation and entering new markets. And we've had, what is like 25 something years of, longer than that, of tech envy.
Yeah. Well, you're right. But even in that book, actually, because he talks about incremental innovation versus disruptive innovation and how incremental innovation short term is by far the best way of creating success. Disruptive technology takes a long time to actually see through, and you need a lot of patience, and you need to, separate out your expertise in the organization and learn new things. It's quite hard to do, and very few companies get it right.
Yeah.
We sort of half learned that. And it's all about innovation and disruption. Constant revolution.
The one that strikes out for me in my career was, I remember I started as marketing director at Lucozade Ribena Suntory, and I remember the CEO telling me, don't mess with the Ribena berries. And I was like, really? I mean, they've been around for ages. What's so special about the Ribena berries kind of thing? And I went through a learning curve, and then we ended up re-airing or slightly improved version of a previous campaign. And it actually smashed it on the System 1 score. And what I got from the debrief, which was very interesting, is that the Ribena berry was the 5th most recognisable distinctive assets that the team had ever tested.
Right.
When in terms of people's associations as British, tasty, natural, all those farming, all those things came out. And the berry itself and Ribena were two intrinsically linked assets, basically. And there's a real lesson to me, actually, is that, as a marketer, you think, how are we going to get a younger consumer in? How are we going to treat all the things? And what I realised is actually the thing was not to mess with the one thing that everyone associated with them.
You said something there about you did a slightly improved version of the berries. What?
So I was working on Ribena, and the creative idea that I inherited was you can't get more Ribenery. And it was basically a dramatic kind of, it was almost a magical fairy tale land of big Ribena berries, having fun, sunshines, rainbows. Back to our Disney point, actually, it felt like if Disney did British farming fruit and Ribena, this is kind of what you'd end up with, sort of thing. And had a very, fun, Zooby-Doo, Zooby-Dah was the soundtrack. So it's kind of very memorable and fun and engaging sort of thing. And I think the team maybe had run it for 3 or 4 years. So there was that kind of internal creative fatigue where it's like, we need to go for a fresh direction. And we'd spent months looking at different routes. And I remember saying to the team, can we just check that the route we're going down is better than the route we've come from? And I don't mind signing off the new route, but can you just go and chuck it in System 1 and just do the due diligence on it, sort of thing? And then I got this message going, oh, good news, bad news. Good news is it's the highest testing soft drink ad ever in the System 1 database. I'm like, what's the bad news? And it was like, oh, we don't get to make the new ad. And so what we did is we just evolved the creative and just, we didn't make that many changes, but the year we
I see. Sorry, you were saying that the previous ad was the highest.
Yes. Okay, so I was doing what a lot of new marketing directors do, which is make the assumption that change was required to achieve growth. Actually, the opposite was true, is that consistency and continuity was actually my friend. So when, rather than spend all the money and effort on doing something new, we kind of evolved incrementally back to our Clayton Christensen thing as an incremental improvement.
What was the evolution?
Oh, very small. No, it was mostly in editing and things like that. So it was. I mean, we simplified it. So in fact, our learning was quite interesting. So it was a bit sort of noisy and a lot going on. And actually what we did, we just simplified it a bit so people got it more quickly. The outdoor, particularly on the out of home, which was sort of, if you imagine like a, sunshine, rainbow, exaggerated berries, bottle of Ribena in grass, that sort of thing. So it beautifully encapsulated, kind of what Ribena is. But the interesting thing from if you were me and the kind of brand team, we thought that was a bit basic. We were like, this is a bit, childish. It's a bit basic. We're not going to win any awards doing this. Yeah. But actually, going back to your consumer is, the most important thing. Yeah. Everyone loved it. It just reminded, Ehrenberg Bass-wise, it just refreshed their memories about what they love about it. And so that was a lesson for me, actually, in terms of.
And the other thing from Specsavers, I don't keep talking about Specsavers, I do think we can learn an awful lot from that. But when you've kept consistent to something like should have gone to Specsavers, creatively, the great bonus then is you can break that and mess with it and do stuff like the home visits. Like I didn't go to Specsavers, you can do. So it is actually quite creatively liberating because the more powerful you've got these things embedded, you can mess around with them.
So that's continuity rather than simple consistency. You've got a thing and you can use it as a jumping off point for something else. Yeah, consistent but fresh. I'm thinking about Schmackos. So we did an IPA paper a couple of years ago on Australian pet food brand Schmackos, and that was an example of, I think it was animated ads that had run for a long time, and they were well loved, but the campaign was getting tired, and I think they had run the same executions for a long time. And then they had a period off air and everything kind of went south, and then they took the decision they wanted to go back on air. But rather than starting completely from scratch, they started with a new version of the old campaign, but it used CGI animation rather than the old, which I think was kind of like flat, traditional animation. So it was continuity, but fresh. And it worked really well.
Great example for Face20.
And with the great slogan, dogs go wacko for Schmacko.
There's nothing like a bit of alliteration or a rhyme or a jingle. I have to say, that's a whole different podcast, that. I think in terms of campaign to get the jingle back, jingle bells back. Number 4, never forget.
God, are we only on number 4?
I know, we're on number 4. I know.
About 20
I think we've covered about 20 different subjects in one there. But there you go. But it's all good. The 4th one I wrote down was never forget the eyeballs. And this is one where I think nuance can be lost, right? There's every headline about TV is dead. Everyone's, Gen Z are only online and this kind of thing. Peter actually was presenting at the ThinkBox conference, a really interesting bit of data. He attention weighted media consumption. So he just adjusted it for the amount of minutes of actual attention achieved. Now, we can have a debate about impressions for, how much attention do you actually need to get an impression, all that kind of stuff. What's fascinating is he had this incredible chart that TV remains number 1 in terms of share of attention, even in the under 35s. What he also found is that actually TV was the second cheapest media on a cost per million once adjusted for attention, which I thought was very interesting. The cheapest media was podcast, by the way, just for freebie for anyone out there that's thinking about sponsoring a podcast. But that's fascinating, wasn't it? Now, again, you've got to balance that with things like YouTube, where, this blew my mind because I had Sophie Neary on the podcast recently, and almost 50% of YouTube is watched on TV. So again, going back to this nuance of the debate, we've got this idea that TV's dead, but just how we consume TV might have changed. But anyway, I think how we reach people is as important as what we reach them with, isn't it?
Yeah, I have so many things to say about that. So I don't want to rant. I mean, the first thing is I slightly disagree with your emphasis there, because you're going down the route of efficiency and, the efficiency of different channels in terms of cost of attention, whatever. If you like, the effectiveness of a campaign is the amount of exposure times the efficiency of that exposure. And efficiency can vary by a factor of 10 or 20, depending, choice of media, choice of creative. The amount of exposure can vary by a factor of 1 million. And we forget that probably the single biggest factor that determines whether or not campaign succeeds or not is sheer bulk sheer weight of exposure, sheer numbers of people seeing the ads. It's not actually media choice or creative execution. It's how much you spend and how many people you reach. And I think we've got ourselves into a state where we've almost felt that spending money to reach a lot of people is cheating, and that it's somehow not the right thing to do, that we should be focusing on efficiency, not effectiveness. Wasn't this that when we wrote our AdMap Mythbuster column, wasn't the very first one we wrote about waste is good?
Yeah.
About the fact that waste is what makes advertising work. I mean, we don't even like to call it advertising anymore. We talk about creating content and, So when I say that eyeballs are important, I mean literally the number of people you reach and the scale of reach. I had a little epiphany earlier on in last year when I was in a meeting where 35 different creative routes were presented and not one of them used paid media and not one of them would reach more than a tiny number of people. And that nobody seemed to think that was important or what mattered. John Lewis, we bang on a lot about John Lewis over the years. And I think in the marketing community, there's almost a feeling that was a viral campaign, I've actually heard people say, of course, that was made predominantly, sharing online. John Lewis was a massive paid media campaign. And typically in 6 weeks, we would reach somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion exposures. And you cannot get that kind of level of exposure using one medium, using unpaid media, using viral sharing or any of those things. Rant over.
No. Well, it also reminds me actually of, I think Ritson made this point when he looked at FEs, looking at what contributes most to effectiveness. The size of your brand was number one. Creativity, fortunately, was number second. So we all had a few.
Can I just correct for that?
Yeah,
actually, I think that's the size of brand. It does relate to effectiveness, but actually, I think the research he's quoting is that the efficiency is driven by the size of the brand, not the effectiveness.
Yeah. But I was going back to the point that actually we forget that scale matters, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like the numbers of people you reach.
Budget.
Back to market penetration matters, your mental availability matters. Back to the scale matters a lot. Particularly if you've ever been a small brand, you know that to your detriment,
I keep coming back to this, budget matters. Probably the biggest thing that determines the effectiveness of a campaign is how much you spend and therefore how many people you reach and so forth. And we've media agencies still think about it, but I think there's a big chunk of our industry that kind of has either forgotten it or doesn't really want to talk about it or kind of feels it's cheating.
It's that kind of wishful marketing, isn't it? That you don't just get a free lunch. And that you
do more with less, et cetera, et cetera.
Social first.
Well, that is a good point, though, because there is a lot of pressure on budgets, and the data is suggesting that actually budgets last year are down to a level almost back to pandemic level. So I think that's probably coming from clients that are being asked to sort of trim their budgets back, and of course you throw AI in and all that kind of thing, and so that there is a lot of marketers are feeling that pressure. So it could be where that mindset is coming from.
But isn't measurement one of the issues that you can't compare kind of apples with how many eyeballs different media are
Absolutely,
getting?
that is an issue. That definitely is an issue.
And some things just sound a lot in terms of YouTube views in the millions. It sounds a lot, but actually it isn't really, and it's certainly not enough.
Yeah, in marketing, 1 million is a small number. I've done some back-of-the-envelope calculations, and for a mainstream UK brand, if you're getting less than 5 million exposures for anything that you do that gets less than 5 million exposures is too small to be measurable, really, in terms of its effect on sales. And yet we mess about with stuff where we go, we got 150,000 likes or whatever, or we got, 20,000 views, or we got 18 uploads or whatever, you just kind of go, all of that stuff can be ignored. Anything that gets less than about 5 million, you should probably just not be doing that. Yeah. Laws of gravity, isn't it? You can't cheat gravity in that sense. Now, also, you were telling me earlier, weren't you, about the 60-40 split and some different data sources as well that have kind of all correlated in the same direction as well. It's a slightly different issue. But Peter and I have talked about how, again, we sort of get some stick. What we're not saying is that all budgets should be split 60-40 between brand and activation, long-term and short-term. But that on average across all categories, for any brand, in any situation, there will be an optimum split. And if you were to estimate the average optimum split across all brands and all categories, it would be around 60-40. And there's another ratio, which is that there's increasing evidence that if you look at the balance of short and long-term effects across many brands and many categories, that also is around 60-40. But all of that's kind of a different issue.
I was just linking to...
The issue that you can probably tell that I'm sort of angry about this is that we have just forgotten about how big campaigns need to be to work, how much you have to spend to do that, and that you cannot do that without paid media spend. And I think to me, we've become ashamed to talk about advertising. That we don't want to call ourselves advertising agencies because somehow the idea that you pay for people's attention, that just feels like old-fashioned and inefficient. Sorry, it's the only way to do it.
No, definitely reality. Well, let's pivot to our number 5 then, which is emotion doesn't mean making Les cry. I remember this time last year, I think you were sort of a half blubbering wreck when you were with all the Christmas ads out. But this is something as well. I mean, I know this quite a lot from System 1, is that people kind of assume that's what you're trying to do. And actually emotions encapsulate lots of different feelings, don't they? All of which contribute. And I mean, I liked actually episode I did with Greg Hahn where he said the biggest risk you face is to be ignored. And actually the primary job of advertising is not to be ignored. But emotion is a powerful vehicle to catch people's attention.
Well, that was probably one of the few downsides of the John Lewis advertising, wasn't it? That it just became this thing that you have to cry to buy, and everyone was trying to compete with each other to make the Christmas ad that made people cry the most. And I think that has gone, hasn't it? It feels like, I think we talked about Be More Banjo last year, didn't we? But it just feels like there's a much more upbeat feel around. I mean, there are some that might make you cry, but not that many anymore, I think. So that feels like that's kind of worked its way through the system a bit, and people realise that there are different emotions that are suitable for different sorts of jobs. I mean, we'll get on to perhaps pre-testing and happiness and things later, but there are lots of different emotions, luckily, that the human being has that we can play on in our communication.
I'd
actually use lots of them.
I'd kind of go slightly wider than that, actually. I mean, you called yourself System 1. When Peter and I first started talking about this, we went through a phase of trying to distinguish between System 1 and System 2 routes of influence. And the reason we chose that language was that System 1 ways of influencing people are not all about emotions. It's about emotions and feelings and associations. So emotions and feelings are slightly different things. Psychologists distinguish between those two. But also there's the associative route where you're creating a kind of Pavlovian conditioning. Brand X is associated with Y. It's not communicating a message, it's creating these System 1 links in the brain. And the problem is that, as you can tell, it takes quite a while to explain that, and people default to talking about emotions, or they talk, Adam and Eve, we talk about feeling first. So there's that issue, and then Sarah says, even if you're talking about emotions or feelings, there's quite a wide palette.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So some of the criticism we sometimes get is that people think the goal is emotion.
Yes.
And it's not.
No.
And what we see in our testing, we look at the role of emotion to help the brand be remembered. So, of course, your first job is to remember who you are.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right about the key association. So what we find is that depending on which emotion you generate will alter the association people have with your brand. So, testing a number of campaigns for one brand, and the takeout, the associations could be completely wildly different based on which emotion you're drawing as well. So that's also important. So, emotion's the vehicle by which you get people to notice you, remember you, associate you with different buying occasions.
You're trying to do several things. You want to make sure that your brand comes to mind in relevant buying situations, relevant situations. So that's what Erin Bass would call mental availability. And part of that is making sure that you've created associations between your brand and particular situations, contexts, mental states, whatever, the things, that the moments where your brand would be relevant. And then the other thing is to create feelings about the brand. So when the brand does come to mind, you feel positive about it. So it's emotions, feelings, and associations.
The other thing we found as well is in our testing that also is important is intensity of those emotions. So in fact, it's something that I think is probably, we haven't drawn out enough at System 1, but we measure how strong that feeling is. And there's a very, very, very close connection between kind of short-term effects and how strong the feeling is as well. Yeah. So, because you can make people feel a little bit, or you can make them feel really passionate about whatever it is as well. And that makes a big difference. Right, so let's go to number 6. Controversial, perhaps, or perhaps not. Is the era of purpose over? What do you think? There you go. He drops that one in there like a little grenade.
I think we've kind of talked about that a bit, haven't we? I mean, there is certainly a lot less talk about it now. Yeah, I mean, some companies, I think everyone has banned it as a word now even. So it's the word that dare not speak its name. So I think it's... we've got a better sense of proportion about it. Or I suppose if I was giving a kind of grown-up reaction to that, I think it's gone back into the box, which it probably should have always have been in before we lost our collective marbles, that it is a strategy for certain brands, probably not many of them, but it's certainly not the strategy for all brands, which is where it was coming. So, more sense of proportion around, I think, and we've all kind of come to our senses, would be my summary of that.
I mean, again, nuance. Purpose is the thing. Purpose is dead. I don't think it's over. I think, as you say, it's one of the things that goes on. But the other thing is, I think we talked about this last year probably, but purpose is not a strategy. If it's a strategy for selling stuff, it's no longer purpose. So true purpose is actually, setting a goal that is not profit. Anything else is just fake purpose. It's purpose washing. And I think where we got into a bit of a muddle was thinking that purpose and business were just naturally aligned. That the way to make more money is to do social good or whatever. And that there's no conflict between those two things. And I think that was just wishful thinking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's Ritson's quote, isn't it? The purpose of purpose is purpose.
Exactly.
But also, purpose comes at a cost, and purpose should be costly. I mean,
absolutely.
And we know from Peter Field's analysis that it does come at a cost because it's not an effective strategy by and large.
Unless your business is in the business of purpose.
Yes,
if you're a Patagonia or
exactly.
You're Tony's Chocolonely, your business is founded on. But even that, I mean, we had Tony's on just before Christmas, and they have to justify quite a significant price premium in order to pay the living wage for cocoa farmers where they source their cocoa from. So there is a big cost, and they make less profit, or they have to charge higher prices to the consumer.
And I think if we did do the purpose inquiry, like the COVID inquiry I was talking about earlier, I think a couple of other things would emerge. One is just the misleading way that dodgy research can lead you astray. It's like, we all know, if you ask people, if I knew that this shampoo made a difference to girls' lives in developing countries, would you buy it more? Well, yeah, of course, you're going to say yes, but that's not the same as that's going to influence you when you're faced with 20 different shampoos at the shop shelf. But the other thing is companies sort of distorting data to show what they feel purpose does, when we're using some sort of dodgy correlations that the brands that use purpose are growing more than others, when is the causation going the other way? And there's just all sorts of dodgy research.
That's probably
going
what
on.
people are reacting to, isn't it? The overreach of purpose
and confirmation
and the dodgy
bias
claims.
in research. There's a whole other podcast on dodgy research use, I think, in this world as well.
And I think we
and lack of market orientation. It does come back to that we're wanting other people to behave in the way that we feel is important, rather than looking at it from the other end of the telescope.
A lot of it is kind of wishful thinking, isn't it? I mean, there's been a lot of dodgy research in that area, and it didn't matter so much in the sort of, decade from 2008 to 2019, because interest rates were, basically money was free. So real interest rates were zero. That means money's free. That means businesses don't have to make a profit to survive. And so you can pursue other goals. And everything changed, basically, once we got past COVID and we moved back into a world where interest rates are positive again. in real terms. I mean, I think anyone who's young will not realise just how exceptional that decade of free money was. I mean, it's unprecedented in the last 200 years. And we've now moved back to normality, which means that companies do actually have to make money now. And there are some quite interesting little data points on that. So, for instance, The Economist magazine, or newspaper as they like to call themselves, have tracked the use of terms like ESG, purpose, DEI, etc., in earnings calls of CEOs talking to, investors. And it's fallen off a cliff. CEOs are no longer talking about that stuff. And ESG market funds, you can choose to invest in purpose-driven companies. For the first time, billions of dollars are flowing out of those funds because people are realising they're not more profitable,
not seeing the return
not giving the return. So to me, those are the things. That message will filter down from CEOs and boards down to us little hobbits at the bottom of the chain. In a couple of years' time, we'll begin to realise that actually nobody wants that stuff anymore.
Well, maybe this links us nicely to the point number 7, which is about don't just be in culture, but stay in culture as a goal. Because I mean, how many briefs you must get to? Yeah, we want to be in culture, be in the conversation.
Yeah.
The best brands are the ones that probably stay in culture, aren't they?
Yeah, I was struck by something the McCain's marketer was saying a month ago, where he was saying he thinks actually fame is overrated because it tends to lead to what he would call fireworks sort of activity, kind of brief flashes in the sky, and then it kind of dies away. And he said he was more interested in lighting bonfires, which I thought was a rather lovely new way of looking at things, really. And we talk very much, we get loads of briefs about we want to get into culture and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, we don't talk so much about staying in culture / people's minds, which is what when we were talking about earlier with brands being built for the long term and memories need to be long term and that kind of stuff. So I thought that was an interesting reframing of what we should be doing. And then this is another conversation, but we've talked before about slogans, jingles, stuff that stay in people's brains for a very long time, and how that tends to have been derided as well. But some of the great campaigns that are winning effectiveness awards show that that's probably a rather misguided point of view as well.
I mean, fame is incredibly powerful. I mean, but enduring fame is kind of what you want. And this is really hard. I mean, saying do something that's going to make you famous, that's like saying have a number one hit record, which is, there's no formula for doing that. And secondly, what you really want is enduring fame. So, what you want is to have a number one hit record, again and again and again, which is hard. But, I mean, two examples. I keep coming back to John Lewis. I mean, we did manage to do that for a decade, didn't we? We did the equivalent of having the Christmas number one every year for a decade. But the other one is Marmite, actually. So what we did there was we inserted ourselves into culture, and in a way that has been quite enduring, in that people, I bet even if we stopped talking about love-hate, people would still say, oh, I'm a bit like Marmite,
Yeah.
People either love me or hate me,
Well, it was one of the things, we did a bit of research when one of the conversations came up about should we change love-hate and drop the hate bit, and we did some research that looked at the awareness of love-hate against other lines, actually, from other brands, I won't say who they are, but who spend a huge amount more money on there, and it was off the scale. So you can't actually erase that from people's minds, even if you want to drop this.
Yeah.
So you may as well push on the open door and go with it, and do something kind of fresh with that familiarity. So yeah.
Well, you've already referenced this one as well, but my favourite in this space is Should Have Gone to Specsavers.
Yeah, exactly.
But even they, after how many years, I think it's probably 17, 18 years or something, they did consider changing about 3 or 4 years ago. I'm like, I can't believe it. You just look at how that's in the vernacular.
Yeah.
And how, this is a bit like what we were saying earlier, the nothing like the freedom of a tight brief.
Yeah.
Because they're so clear on what they're about, that actually that liberates you, doesn't it? It's creatively to express it and break the rules a little bit
and
with
go
it
with
as well.
I didn't go Specsavers rather than junking the
There you
line
go. And then
completely.
you're still leveraging
play with
consistency.
it, but yeah, exactly.
Well, it seamlessly brings me to number 8, actually, which is don't forget the power of out of home. Because I think my favourite out of home campaigner last year, I don't know if you guys saw this, was did you see in Sydney Airport, they did a massive Specsavers ad saying welcome to Melbourne.
Yeah, exactly.
Just that's so simple.
Yeah.
So simple. And that, like, like everyone was talking about it. But I just thought, how clever. And I was at the cinema the other day, and they had the ad upside down.
Yep.
You know, should have gone Space. Because at first you're going, hang on, what's going on here?
The one I liked,
the cameraman's got it wrong. But then you realise, of course, the joke's
the one I liked was there was somebody drove through the middle of a roundabout somewhere in the south of England and smashed all the flowers up and stuff like that. And within a day or so, Specsavers had put a poster up on the roundabout saying should have gone to Specsavers.
Yeah.
So clever.
So outdoor, I was kind of going to mention this earlier on, actually. In today's world, outdoor has now overtaken TV as the medium that has the broadest reach and the highest number of exposures. So I think it should be compulsory that everybody in our industry, in the UK at least, should scrutinise the IPA Touchpoint survey when it comes out every year. Because what that shows very clearly is now outdoor is the only way you can reach everyone. And you mentioned the attention research. Did they look at outdoor?
I don't think so. I better check. Sorry, before I say, but I think it's audio visual on different platforms. Attention. So that'd be interesting.
You said TV's still the medium.
Yeah.
You know, but so they're missing a very big and important medium there. And of course, nowadays, some outdoor is maybe not audio, but it's visual.
It is.
I often think, they should stop calling it digital out of home or something, call it, like out of home video or something like that. So I think it's kind of a forgotten medium to some extent. We don't talk about it nearly enough.
We don't do it.
Having said that, there are some challenges about measuring the effectiveness of outdoor. And you can see why, for example, it might not be in that attention research, because it's not something you can so easily show someone on a screen in a controlled environment.
We got a partnership actually with JC Decaux. We're doing some work at the moment looking at the link between emotion, star rating effectively, but emotion and success of out-of-home campaigns. So very early days. We won't publish for another couple of months, but direction looking very, very
and it's
promising.
Creatively an interesting space as well. I mean, we're
really
recording
is.
This in Uncommon Studios, and shout out to them for their Monzo ads and their British Airways ads, and I think it's a really good test of a strong idea. If you Specsavers do great posters as well. If you, in our world that's getting ever more complicated, if you've got an idea that you can do a good poster from, you've got a good idea. And so I think creatively it's a very interesting space as well for us to think more of all of you, because you're right, it just tends to get overlooked. And
it's the one medium that reaches both young and old people.
Yeah.
It does, doesn't it? And probably a lot of wastage, he says, in quotes.
Yes, and waste is good.
Positive
Back to waste is good, but that's where everyone sees you, not just the target audience that you might be paying excess money for.
We know that the primary driver of media effectiveness is reach, and outdoor is the one with the highest reach. But there are challenges. So, for instance, you talked about the fact you're going to be doing or are doing some research, but that's about creative efficiency. And what I'm worried about is measuring exposure, getting back to counting the eyeballs. And that is hard to do. And that matters because if you want to do econometric modelling or market mix modelling, you've got to have that data to put in. And if you haven't got good exposure data, then you won't get a proper measure of effectiveness of ROI, payback, whatever. And therefore, outdoor is always lowballed in terms of effectiveness in those sorts of quantitative studies.
But listen, thank you both. As always, it's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening or watching Uncensored CMO. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please do hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching, hit subscribe there as well. I'd also love to get a review. Reviews make a big difference on other people discovering the show. So please do leave a review wherever you get your podcast. If you want to contact me, you can do. I'm over on X at UncensoredCMO or on LinkedIn, where I'm under my own name, John Evans. Thanks for listening and watching. I'll see you next time.